If you guys want to come up front here, I'll tell everyone that's with us. I'm Mel Boynton from the Arts and Education Board, and we're here at a session. We're talking about banning books. And one of the things we're so happy.
Thank you.
Yeah, and your name?
My name is Janie Monk. I'm a resident of Pilgrim Place, and I'm very happy to be here this morning.
And the Pilgrims have arranged to contribute a couple of books to our banned books section of our library. And this one is called Pride Puppy. And so in a couple of versions?
Yes, we have a board book and a picture book format. So you can choose which you want in your library, which you want to go in your little free library. May I say a little bit about the book?
Yes,
just briefly.
Please. Sure.
This book, small as it is, will be on the required reading list for the U.S. Supreme Court this year. Families, despite its innocuous storyline and plot, families have found it so objectionable because it involves attendance at a pride parade that they have sued to allow their students, their children, to opt out of instructional settings where this book and others like it are in use. So it is at the center of a case that was turned down by the Fourth Circuit, is now going to the Supreme Court to be heard sometime this year. It has not yet been calendared, but it has been approved for hearing. So Pilgrim Place residents, when they learned of this, decided we could take a small action. This is something we could support. And so we purchased 90 copies of the book. 2 of them are going to be donated here. Many more will be going to local schools and public libraries so that students and parents can make up their own minds about what they want to read.
Thank you to the Pilgrims for donating a book to our banned book section of the church library. And thanks so much. Well, I want to introduce our featured speaker this morning right away, and thank you to the Pilgrims. This is a great step forward. Susan McWilliams Barndt is a professor of politics at Pomona College, where she has won the Wig Award for Excellence in Teaching 4 times. Wow. Amazing. She's a prolific author. She comes from a long line of political scientists. You've probably heard the name McWilliams before. Her grandfather, her father, she's a distinguished family legacy there. She has edited numerous books. She holds a BA in political science and Russian from Amherst College, MA and PhD in politics from Princeton University. Thank you and welcome to Susan McWilliams.
Great. Thanks, Mel. And thanks to all of you for coming. Just a couple preparatory notes, one of which is that earlier this week, I gave a talk in Arizona, and a terrible, terrible thing happened, which is that for the first time, and I hope some of you have had this experience, the glasses that used to allow me to see both the audience and the paper now no longer work for both. So bear with me as I awkwardly take my glasses on and off for the next 30 minutes. The second thing I'll say is that, first awkward move of glasses, is that this is the first time, though I've talked about book bans before, and even in Claremont, this is the first time I'm giving a talk about book banning or even American politics in general since President Trump took office. And so part of what I'm interested in doing, both for myself and here, is to talk about book banning in a way that may at least gesture at being helpful to understanding broader things about the Trump administration. But when we get to question and answer, if you want to ask bigger picture questions, that really is on my mind in this moment, as I know it's on yours. Okay, in any case, book banning, though it may seem to many of us like a very anti-American thing, has a long and storied history in the United States. The first book ban that we think happened in what we now call the United States happened in 1637, when Thomas Morton published New England Canaan, which was a critique of Puritan customs. It was quickly banned by the Puritan authorities for being heretical. He suggests in that book that Plato's Republic is a book worth reading. Shocking, right? He condones dancing, and he calls Puritans crustaceans. You could see why it was totally unacceptable at the time. 2 centuries later, Uncle Tom's Cabin is probably the first book that's subject to really broad, geographically speaking, bans in the United States. You won't really have to guess why. The Confederacy thought that it was too abolitionist and therefore was dangerous. And in fact, it's actually the post-Civil War period that's probably the height of book banning in the United States. After a guy, and you will have heard this term before, a guy named Anthony Comstock convinces Congress to pass a law that prohibits the mailing of pornographic materials. But as some of you will know, the definition of pornographic in that law was so vague that it ended up being a situation where everything from like anatomy textbooks to the Canterbury Tales was banned because of what was called Comstockery, the Comstock laws. All of that changed in 1933. When a decision in the United States versus one book called Ulysses, one of the great Supreme Court case titles ever, it overturns an 11-year-long national ban on James Joyce's Ulysses. And in that case, Judge Woolsey ultimately ruled that there was a legitimate place for the description and discussion of sex in literature. That opened up a lot of books to being published in the United States that hadn't been published before. And then in 1957, in the case of Roth versus the United States, the Supreme Court radically narrowed the definition of obscenity. So the definition of obscenity becomes that which is utterly without redeeming social importance. And that decision led to an almost total collapse of book banning in the United States that started in about the early 1960s. All of which is to say that there was a period of time not too long ago and which made up the bulk of most of all of our lives when the idea of book banning in the United States seemed very quaint and very much the product of a bygone era. In fact, if you had told me 10 years ago that I would be speaking 10 years hence on a book banning epidemic at the UCC, I would have said, you're crazy. At the time, I taught a course at Pomona College called Dangerous Books. And it was a course that was based on a list that the conservative journal Human Events had compiled. And it was called like the 10 most dangerous books of the 19th and 20th centuries. And you know, so we read the books in the class, right? Like we read from 1 to 10. And part of what we talked about every year was a good way of tricking students into reading political theory by making it seem more subversive, right? Like, and part of what we talked about every year was the fact that even though certain highbrow Americans found those books harmful or dangerous, like none of them. And those books included Mein Kampf, The Little Red Book, The Communist Manifesto. Nobody, it also included Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It was really, it's a wild list. But none of those books, part of what we talked about is that none of those books like really faced any meaningful like banning energy in the United States. And I told a lot of jokes 10 years ago about how Americans didn't take books seriously enough anymore to even consider banning them. So like for those reasons, many other reasons, I would have thought that the current situation was a bit ludicrous. Indeed, in 2015, there were only 275 formal requests to ban books across the United States. That's a statistical insignificance in a country of 300-something million people. And most of those book ban requests were about a single book. Some of you may know it. It's called And Tango Makes Three. And it was about a pair of gay penguins who had raised a baby together in the Central Park Zoo. I mean, it's not condoning dancing or anything like that, but but by 2023, which is the last year I think we have good data for, there were 1,247 formal requests to ban books across the United States. Those requests targeted a total of 4,240 books. That's the highest number ever recorded by the American Library Association. Other groups have slightly different numbers, but what everybody agrees on is that there's been a massive rise in the number of formal requests to ban books. That recent energy has culminated in actions in the last 4 weeks by the Trump administration that have worried everyone who worries about book banning. You may have missed it in the flurry of news of late, but on January 24th, the Department of Education revoked all guidance that characterizes book bans as violations of civil rights laws. And 2 weeks ago, the Department of Defense pulled many books off the shelves in US military schools. This has gotten a little bit more press, to review them for compliance with the president's executive orders about DEI and gender ideology. A kind of fun fact, because we need reasons to laugh in this moment, is that one of those books that the DoD has pulled from its shelves is Vice President Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, because it contains profanity, references gay people, and has passages that celebrate racial diversity, features that may conflict with those executive orders. So what's going on? How do we understand this moment? I want to give you a kind of good news, bad news story. And the good news is going to be book banning still isn't popular and it's largely performative. I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, but here's the bad news. Even so, it points us to real problems in American politics, and maybe not the problems that we think. So good news. This is the happy part of the Sunday morning part of the talk. Book banning isn't popular, and I think the best way to understand it is as performative. Here's what I mean by that. First, a large majority of Americans are opposed to book banning. Every survey that I can find, and probably every survey that you can find too, finds that a huge majority of Americans, somewhere between 75 and 90%, oppose book banning in all cases. About the same percentage of Americans agree that public school teachers deserve the trust or have their trust for designing curricula and selecting books. And in fact, I think the most popular, I know that there are former or current librarians in here. Librarians, I think, are the most popular public servants in American life today. 92% of parents, grandparents, and guardians say that they trust librarians to curate appropriate books and materials, and that trust extends to their recommendations for children. And while, as you might guess, Democrats are more likely than Republicans to oppose book bans and curriculum restrictions, they are only slightly more likely. The surveys vary, but the minimum Republican opposition to book bans is about 70%, right? So like the highest support within the Republican Party. And I want to say the Republican Party is only 25% of the American population right now. It's really important if you want to understand American politics to know 50% of Americans say they're independents, 25 about say they're Democrats, about 25% say they're Republicans. So if you see a survey, this is a side note that says, I don't know, 50% of Republicans believe that, I don't know, the earth is flat, right? Don't imagine, as I think it's our tendency to imagine, that that's a survey of 50% of voters. It's a survey of 25% of voters. So just there's not that many Republicans out there. But even among like people who still call themselves Republicans, like 70% of them at minimum oppose book bans, compared to a minimum Democratic opposition of about 75%. So book banning is not popular. There's not a like statistically significant groundswell there. Second, most book banning attempts are made by an almost ridiculously small group of people. Most book banning attempts have been part of a very concerted campaign by 3 relatively small advocacy groups, the most well-known of which is the Moms for Liberty, headquartered in the place where my husband and I grew up. In 2023, does anyone know this? How many adults were responsible for like 60% of the book ban requests in the United States? It's 11. 11 individuals were responsible for 60% of the book bans requests in the nation's school libraries. That means, among other things, that there's a pretty easy legal political response to most of the book banning attempts in the United States. Local officials anywhere, Claremont has not done this but could, can pass laws that someone needs to be a resident of a municipality to like challenge the books in the public school curriculum or library. Indeed, I think there are efforts underway in such places. I haven't heard of them in Claremont, but in addition to the fact that there's a fairly like relatively easy legal and political fix to so many, like to the 11 people who are really behind much of this, I think it's an important reminder, and actually having the Pilgrim Placers here, a relatively small group of people can affect massive changes even in a nation this big. Power usually goes to those people who are willing to go to the mat. And that's more true all the time. You know, we say in my line of work that winning in a democracy isn't about population. That's what we always think. It's 50% plus 1%. It's actually about perspiration. So take heart. If 11 people can do all of that work, right? What could 12 people, right, do on the other side? I think this really is a moment where we need to remind ourselves, and it's appropriate, and you know, in a Christian church, to remember how much of like Jesus's example and teaching is about how 12 people can transform the world. It's also, and on top of all of that, and this is like a kind of new thing I've been thinking about since Trump got elected. It's not like those people actually think that individual book bans are that meaningful or effective, right? And that's why I call these book bans largely performative. Because anybody who's attempting to get a book banned from a school knows something that all of us should know, which is that in this technological environment, it is nigh impossible to keep a book out of the hands of someone, particularly a teenager, who is determined to read it. Teenagers don't need institutional support, although they're getting it in this moment. I hope that all of you know about, and if you don't, I'll tell you about, the Books Unbanned program. I see some heads nodding, but our own county library was instrumental in this, and they've started a partnership with, I think it's the Seattle, Boston, San Diego, and Brooklyn public libraries. And what they do through the Books Unbanned program is that they will give free digital library cards to teenagers, even teenagers who don't live within their county borders, that allows them to borrow digital books from within the county system. So any teenager in California can get a Los Angeles library Books Unbanned card, and then they can read whatever banned books they want. People who are banning books, trying to ban books, they know this too, right? They know that those movements are out there. They know that kids can go on Amazon or on, I don't know, whatever else the kids are doing these days and get whatever they want. But they do know that they get a lot of attention for banning books. Book bans have gotten disproportionate public attention. There are some evident reasons for that. Journalists are very worried about book banning, and journalists write stories. Educated people are particularly worried about book banning, and educated people have disproportionate public voice. So one of the things I really want to consider here is the fact that the book banning epidemic, by pretty much any read, is more about performance than it is about real public, right? There's not a big public force behind it. It gets disproportionate attention because it freaks people out. And I think it's in the end more about a certain kind of attention than it is about meaningful action. Okay, that's the good part of my speech. But even so, even if you understand that book banning isn't popular and it's largely performative, I do think it points us to real problems on the ground in American politics, and maybe not the ones you think. I'm going to suggest two of those things today. I think I have time to do that. The first is that part of why people say that this kind of thing, you've heard this phrase, owns the libs, right? This is an owns the lib kind of thing, is that these kinds of performative attention-grabbing actions on the right work people on the left into a lather. And one of the things that does is distract people on the left from bigger scales, inequities, and injustices, right? Because cultural issues, right, are so easy for people to understand, it's very easy for those to distract us from bigger picture questions, particularly of economic inequality and injustice. I don't want to malign Mel or any of you, but I'm asked to speak about book bans a lot in Claremont. Never once in Claremont have I been asked to speak about book deserts, which are a much more critical public policy problem. You'll never see book deserts covered in the news. Most people haven't even heard the phrase. But a book desert is a place where people, particularly children, don't have access to books, period. Right? That means a kid doesn't have books at home, doesn't have a local library, doesn't have a local bookstore, and doesn't have access to any extra reading material in school. And according to the US Department of Education, may it live a long, healthy life, 45% of American children live in neighborhoods that lack public libraries and bookstores. That means that more than 35 million children go without almost any books in their lives, banned or unbanned or whatever. That's a huge public policy problem. And of course, needless to say, most of the children who live in places that are book deserts are poor, Black, and Latino. If there is a major injustice, and there can be multiple injustices in the world, right? But if there's a major injustice related to books and kids these days, it's not just that there are some books being banned in some places. It's that almost half of American children don't have access to any books at all. And on the right, pursuing a kind of targeted book banning strategy has been very successful in distracting many of the people who I think of as my people from much larger scale injustices, particularly like very specifically around children and books. And that's actually a big part of what brings many of the book banners such joy, right? The phrase own the libs means that they are owning your attention, they are directing your energy, they are stealing your time, and they are preventing you from doing the kind of work that I assume that most book banners really want to be doing, which is work in the service of equity and justice. I will say, totally coincidentally, Sycamore is actually doing a book drive this week for the Book Truck, which is our county's premier nonprofit organization that brings books to kids in our county, and there are millions of them who live in book deserts. So I brought a flyer for that, and there's actually a QR code on that if you want to donate a book to kids in book deserts, in addition to doing the kind of work that you're doing to fight book bans. I'll leave that with Mel. I have a few copies of that. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. I'll hold it up. Maybe it will work for people. I don't know. I'm not a tech person. Okay. But I'll leave these here. That's sort of point one that I think we should think about with regards to book bans. Like it raises a broader problem about what a kind of performative politics on the right does to the attentions of people, broadly speaking, on the left. Second, and this is where I'm going to say something that's going to make you very irritated, but bear with me. I don't think that we should, even though I think that most book banning is performative, I don't think we should dismiss all book banners as merely malicious. I think there's a bigger picture here that's a little bit more sympathetic, and bear with me. These days, when the internet is omnipresent, and even children whose parents like me do not let them have smartphones, they're still required to use iPads by their school. It's hard to keep any material out of the hands of children. The LA County Library Books Unbanned story is the good side of that, but there's a really bad side of that, and we do not talk about it enough. American children today, almost no matter how vigilant their parents are exposed every day to age-inappropriate material. And I think in many ways, while the target is misguided, book banning speaks to a real concern about the exposure of American children to age-inappropriate material. And here's an interesting fact. In survey after survey, just as big a majority of Americans who oppose book banning, about 75%, say that they are worried about their children's exposure to inappropriate content, particularly sexual content. It's true across races, partisan divides, and other demographic groups. I'll skip some stuff here. 69% of American teenagers say that they've been contacted by predatory strangers online. The explosion of free, easily accessible, violent, racist, disturbing pornography is a real problem. I only really came to appreciate this last year in teaching a senior seminar at Pomona College in politics, where we were reading like a rather sort of like morally serious book called Rethinking Sex by Christine Emba. It's a great book. And my students is like, she doesn't talk about porn at all in here. And porn is the thing we need to be talking about. And I was like, what? I don't talk about porn in my classes. And my students really convinced me. They grew up as 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7-year-olds seeing super violent, super confusing pornography all the time. In fact, 90% of children, we think, under the age of 16 have seen violent, degrading, hardcore pornography. About 70% of children ages 7 to 15 that say that they've accidentally encountered pornography online, most often as a result of doing a web search that was assigned to them as part of their homework. And about half of parents say that pornography is a problem in their home. Now, let me try to connect some dots here. I think if we looked from the perspective of that cultural picture, we can see why some panicked and anxious parents would be all of a sudden interested in putting limits on the things their children can see, right? And it's probably not an accident that these challenges in book banning start to rise at the exact same time that iPads become required for all children and teachers in the majority of American public schools. I know that the temptation is to tie this to Trumpism and the rise of Trump, but that's actually like, it's not entirely wrong, but the dates don't line up. Still, bear with me still, I suspect we would all agree that even if we're sympathetic to the plight of American parents who are trying to negotiate a world in which their children are often exposed to age-inappropriate material, it seems very weird that Americans would focus their energies on libraries and schools rather than, say, on tech companies or entertainment companies, right? It seems like they've chosen the wrong targets. And this leads me to my next thought, that the rise of book banning reflects a sense of impotence that Americans have in the face of growing corporate and private power. As the left-wing author Elizabeth Anderson has said in her book, Private Government, and as the conservative author Saurabh Amari has detailed in his book, Tyranny, Inc., Americans increasingly live in a culture where we are beholden to the decisions, preferences, and dictates of private corporate powers. And we have very little recourse against those corporate powers, right? Companies set prices, individuals pay them. Now, sure, we might be able to shop around for a lower price, but in practice, that's hard to do, especially in highly consolidated industries. If Netflix wants to raise its prices and you want to watch a show that is only on Netflix, you have to pay its price, right? Like there isn't actually, or, another example that Amari has in his book, employers write contracts, employees sign them, right? In theory, you can object to a contract that you're like an equal party to it. Let's say a non-disclosure agreement. But if you need to feed your family, you don't have any leverage with a multinational corporation. There's a kind of pervasive myth that you have a choice and are an equal party to the contract, but you're basically coerced into accepting the terms of the contract. So in an age of overwhelming technological and corporate power, what would it even mean to try to get rid of or limit all of the inappropriate content to which children are exposed? Companies are going to say, if they say anything at all, you have a choice. You don't need to have internet at your home, when of course you pretty much do need to have internet at your home. It's a fool's errand for an individual to take on corporate or technological power in that way. But you know what it's not a fool's errand to do? To signal like your broader concern by taking on a government power, particularly a local government power. In that context, I think book banning makes a little more sense because government has to be accountable to its citizens, particularly at the local level. If you write a complaint to Google, they don't ever have to respond to you. They don't. They don't need your business as an individual. They're not beholden to you, but a local school board has to respond to you if you're standing in front of them. So part of the way that I read book banning is as a fairly last ditch and minor desperate form of action, a kind of Hail Mary by people whose concerns are much bigger and more legitimate but who operate in a system where their real targets are distant and unresponsive and overwhelming. And I am sympathetic to the complaint that if Democrats have consistently managed to do something wrong, it is that Democrats have consistently managed to not give voice to Americans' frustration with like corporate and technological power, and have allowed that kind of frustration to be directed at government instead of directed to its proper targets. The real problems out there are, of course, the exploitative and overwhelming private powers that dominate our age, their almost total disregard for the emotional, mental, moral, and spiritual well-being of children, and a government that has failed to rein in, regulate, or just hold to account those great private powers, right? The place of Elon Musk in the last couple of weeks is just a caricature of a parody of something that's been true for a long time. So where do we go from here? I think if we want to think about book banning going forward, I do advocate thinking in those terms. I mean, there are obvious things to do, like what this church is doing. Ban books on your shelves. That's the kind of easy thing. But I do think that we should start thinking in those terms with some sympathy for the impulses of book banners. And I say in general, I think we always do better political thinking when we try to figure out where our points of sympathy are with others, rather than stopping at the kind of demonization and characterization and mystification that is far too like dominant in American politics right now. In this case, I do think we need to take seriously and with sympathy the conditions that I see underlying a rise in book banning. And like I said, I think it's the fact that all of us live in a world with almost totally unresponsive corporate and technological powers that are scary, that are intrusive, and that we have very little recourse as individuals in being able to affect. There are a few things I think that we might do at a local or state level to push back against corporate intrusions, particularly into the lives of children that have been waged in the name of technological advance. First, children don't need iPads to learn. And in fact, there's mounting, if not overwhelming evidence that mandatory iPad programs have had negative learning outcomes. Anecdotally, my two children who have grown up without smartphones love to come home and show me all the ways they've hacked their school iPads to be able to play games during class. Schools should also, I think, I was talking about this with a teacher before we started, schools should have bans on iPhones. I don't think that's a hard question. LAUSD has passed one. I think it's shameful that Claremont Unified School District hasn't yet, though I know it's in discussion. But I think more broadly, we might also push our own legislatures to take more actions to limit corporate power and corporate intrusions, particularly when it comes to tech companies. For instance, we could support one of the few pieces of bipartisan legislation that are out there. It was proposed by the unlikely pair of Senators Hawley and Blumenthal. It's the No Section 230 Immunity for AI Act, that would strip AI companies of the sweetheart government deal they currently have that allows them to avoid accountability for the harmful content produced by their technology. I don't have time to get in the whole history of Section 230 of the communications legislation, but it is basically legislation that treated tech outlets like bookstores. And just like you wouldn't hold a bookstore like owner responsible for the content in a book that they sold, right? This law basically, and this was passed in the early 1990s before the internet really took shape. It was like, oh, companies that have our technology aren't responsible for the content that they or their algorithms produce, right? But of course, a platform isn't the same as a bookstore. And that bipartisan legislation, I think, is really important. It's currently being blocked by Ted Cruz. There are other bills out there, most of them bipartisan, to try to rein in big tech's special privileges. I think there's a kind of interesting side effect there that, like, this is a bipartisan, it's one of the few places where even in the current Congress, there's a lot of bipartisan energy. These may be the kind of issues which could end some of the polarization in American politics. I think we should also in general think about other ways to protect and nurture children. I'm always haunted by the words of the historian Christopher Lasch, who in 1991 wrote that to see the contemporary United States through the eyes of a parent was to see the contemporary United States in its worst possible light, since this is a country in so many ways which treats children as disposable. I had to mention again to my children this week that when I was growing up, we didn't do lockdown drills. That wasn't a thing we could even have imagined. But children like books aren't and shouldn't be disposable. I think it's a funny kind of hope to hope that thinking about book banning can point us toward a vision of a better American politics. But it's a hope that I have nonetheless. And I think any degree of hope in any political moment is always worth holding on to. Thanks a lot. I'm happy to take questions.
Since we have one microphone, we're going to repeat the question when you receive it. Questions, comments? Jack.
I can understand contemplating a book ban that involves pornography or exploitation of another human, but what's the legal rationale for banning a book about Rosa Parks or some other political type of disagreement?
I mean, so the question is, understand why there might be a justification for banning something pornographic, but what's the legal justification for banning a book, say, on Rosa Parks? That question presumes that there has to be a legal justification. And I don't think that there does have to be a legal justification. Part of what is very compelling to a lot of people about at least the rhetoric of the current administration, and given everything that I said, I want, like, in the broader cultural picture, I 100% understand why people like this language. It's language that says there should be more local control, right? Communities should be able to determine, right? What parents should be able to have some say in what it is that their children see. And if you believe, right, if you believe in that as a general principle, then you don't need to say, well, you know what, if this is a community where people don't want their children to read about Rosa Parks, that's legitimate, right? I'm not defending that as a principle, but I think that it's a question that doesn't quite like speak to the headspace of the people who are doing this. Right. And a lot of it is not about the things it seems to be about. So here's how I think about the current moment a lot. And those of you who are parents, like hopefully this will resonate with you. Like when you have a 8-year-old who's throwing a fit, right? Like there's the thing that the fit seems to be about, and then there's the real thing, right? And with an 8-year-old, it's usually like they're hungry, they're tired, right? Something happened at school that you don't know about. And I think that's the way I try to read a lot of what's going on in American politics. There's a thing that it seems to be about, and then there's the real thing that's underneath it. And I find that it's often more easy for me to be sympathetic to the thing that's underneath it. And then I think you encounter a different kind of question. Okay, if I'm sympathetic to people on this lower register, how do I think about talking to them in a way that makes them realize, right? Like, to use your example, that, okay, banning a book about Rosa Parks isn't actually going to achieve the thing that you want to achieve. It's not actually going to solve the problem that's really plaguing you. I know that that's hard to do in so many ways because so much of what is happening on the surface is so morally objectionable. But I do think it's the way that I can think about having a kind of hope for transforming American politics going forward.
We'll ask the Zoomers if you want to make a comment or a question in the chat. We'll try and get to you. Other questions and comments here? Yes.
I'm glad we kind of ended up on corporate power and the technocracy because I was concerned about, I was going to ask you to comment on things like corporate bans, like, you know, as a Palestine solidarity activist, like went to go find Yahya Sinwar's book, not sold on Amazon. They sell Mein Kampf and a whole bunch of other horrible things, but they don't sell anything written by Sinwar. And also the kind of the grassroots sort of book banners, the people that go in, check out the books at the library. It's a lot easier, and then just never give them back. It's a lot easier to do that than actually get a policy passed.
Yeah, that is, from my understanding, what happens in Claremont all the time, that people check out the books and just don't return them. And like it's a particularly quiet, non-legible form of political action. Now, among political scientists, we think a lot in the terms of the political scientist James C. Scott, who talked about weapons of the weak. right? How do you act politically when you perceive yourself to be out of power, right? Like in a really like fundamental way. And he says, like, you basically act in all of these ways that are illegible to the state, but sort of achieve your ends, right? So pulling a book from a local library in that way is a kind of like weapon of the weak. And I do think that's instructive in two ways. One, to know that there are people acting in this way, that there are things happening that you can't see that don't make the news. But also, there are a whole bunch of things that can be done toward other ends that aren't legible to the state that we can all do. In fact, right, it's probably not very legible to the state that there's a library in this church that people can come to. And I do think that we're in an era where it would behoove all of us to think about kind of small scale political actions that we can take that aren't legible to Amazon, that aren't legible to the state. I think many great social movements have started out like as very illegible, like you want to think of them as back room, small scale. We're so used to announcing everything that we're doing like on the internet that we forget the value of how much can be achieved when you don't tell anybody what you're doing and you don't draw attention to yourself at first. And that has actually that has happened a lot, like sort of that's the part of the book banning story that often gets missed, but just as it can work toward one end, it can always work toward another. And that's why certain kinds of books are dangerous to Amazon, in part because that is a key lesson, right, of exactly the kind of books that you have.
On the couch over here.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I'm about what you said about being sympathetic to what's going on in the news. And I read an article by David French in the New York Times, and he had said the best thing that we can do is just befriend somebody on the other political side. So I did that, and I have this wonderful friend now who is diametrically opposed to me politically. Lovely person. But I realized that every time I go visit her, and I said, I cannot talk politics, cannot do it. I care about you, but no. Fox News is on, right? So in terms of like trying to find, like I realized when we talk, we actually have a lot in common. There's a lot of sympathy here. We see a lot of things that are wrong with our society, like you were saying about the parents who are upset about what's going on with kids. So, but how do we bridge this divide when the news that we're getting is just so skewed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe like one of the most important questions I think in American politics right now, which is even if we can befriend people individually on the other side, how do we really break through when we're getting totally different like sources of news and live in totally different like cultural spaces? I don't know that I have a great answer for it. I will say that social scientists have been concerned for 70 years about the decline of civic life in the United States. Probably a lot of you have read about what the past Surgeon General calls the epidemic of loneliness. And I really, really think that a key part of understanding what's happened in American politics is to understand fewer Americans go to church, fewer Americans participate in bowling leagues, fewer Americans have like casual social connections with people that aren't pre-filtered through the politicizing lenses of like education, class, so, I mean, I tell my students like throw more parties and save the republic. And it's not quite a joke. I do think even like it may feel like, right, molehill against the mountain, but I think that the more that we can encourage a more vibrant civic life, and I do think that involves like actually putting down phones and things like that and interacting with each other. It sounds kumbaya-ish and it sounds like insufficient, but the one predictor like consistently of success of modern democratic societies is the level of social trust within that society, right? Like that is the consistent predictor. Like regimes can survive, democratic regimes can survive pretty serious material inequality, but like they cannot survive conditions of massive social distrust. And so as a political theorist, I would say like keep doing what you're doing, try to right? Like as much as possible, maybe like turn off the news a little bit. I'll say as a side note here, one of the things that's been really devastating in American politics is the decline of local journalism. Because local journalism meant that even if your friend was watching Fox News and you were watching CNN, you were both reading, like where I grew up, the Hunterdon County, right, like newspaper. And you had local authorities who you trusted because you knew them to filter news in a way that was very relevant to the places you live. I'm not one of these people who enjoys going on TikTok or Reddit right now and seeing farmers in the Midwest who are like, I voted for Trump and now I'm going to lose my farm. I didn't have time to do the research. I see a lot of people mocking those farmers, but they're not wrong, because 20 or 30 years ago, there would have been a local paper that they would have read or their neighbors would have read that would have said, Trump's policy is likely to help like hurt farmers in this town. That information just isn't there anymore because there aren't local authorities who can filter that information to people. And so you actually don't have time to do the research, because you'd have to like go on, you basically have to replicate the work of a newspaper reporter from 30 years ago to figure out the same information that you could have gotten like either reading a local newspaper or talking to other people who read a local newspaper 30 years ago. So I would say everyone here should be subscribed to the Claremont Courier just as a way to support local journalism, but that's a big piece of this story.
Thank you, Professor McWilliams. Yeah. I'm gonna kick the professor out because she has to take her son to church. So I will share this QR code from the book drive, and I'll try and hold it steadily enough so that the Zoomers can see it. And you, yes, I think we could do that. We're also recording today. I'll hold it again and I'll pass this around so people in the room can shoot the QR code as well. Thank you. If you want to make a contribution to the book drive here for banned books, we're buying banned books for our library, and we appreciate your support. This QR code is, of course, for the bookmobile, not the church drive, but we want to be in partnership with like-minded folks. I really appreciate the good crowd we've had today. I think we've got 50 or so people here, and we appreciate your support for these topics. And if you have other topics you want the Arts and Education Board to be tackling, please be in touch with us. I'm Mel Boynton, I'm one of the members, and we appreciate your time this morning. Have a great service this morning. See you in church.